Rain hammered Shadowmoon City like it had a personal grudge against the place. It came down in gray sheets, turning the long gravel driveway into a shallow river and filling every crack in the old stone walls with cold, dark water. Harper Voss had been driving for 40 minutes through that mess, her windshield wipers losing the argument against the downpour, the directions on her phone cycling between 3 different wrong turns before depositing her in front of the most aggressively ugly building she had ever seen in her 23 years of life. The manor sat at the top of a low hill, like it was brooding about something. Towers at each corner. Stone gargoyles crouched on the parapets, their mouths open, vomiting rainwater onto the grounds below. Half the upper floor windows were boarded over. The iron gate at the end of the drive had rusted itself permanently open, as if even the gate had given up. A single dead oak tree leaned toward the front facade at an angle that suggested structural advice. Harper sat in her little hatchback for a full 30 seconds, staring at it. Then she looked down at the manila folder on the passenger seat. The property deed from her great-aunt, Meredith's estate, was on top, her name printed clearly across the front. Harper Elaine Voss. Sole inheritor of Voss Manor, Shadowmoon City, valued in the estate filing at a generous and almost certainly fraudulent sum that the probate lawyer had described as optimistic. She grabbed the folder, pulled her hood up, and got out of the car. The gravel crunched under her boots as she walked up to the front entrance, the rain flattening her auburn hair against her forehead despite the hood. Up close, the front doors were enormous. Heavy oak, black iron hardware, the kind of doors that belonged on a medieval cathedral rather than a residential property in a modern city. One of them had a thick chain looped through the handles with a padlock on it. She tested it. The padlock held. She tried the other handle. Locked from the inside. She stepped back, rain dripping off the end of her nose, and assessed the situation with the calm practicality of someone who had spent the last 3 years living on a freelance illustrator's income and had therefore stopped expecting things to be easy. Then she raised her right foot and kicked the door. It didn't budge. She kicked it again, harder, putting her whole body behind it. The chain rattled. Something on the inside shifted. On the third kick, the wood around the interior bolt gave a crack, and both doors swung inward together, the chain snapping taut and then giving with a sound like a gunshot as the rotted timber of the left door split away from its mounting. Harper stumbled forward into the doorway, caught herself, pushed her wet hair out of her face, and looked up. The grand hall of Voss Manor was lit by industrial work lights strung from iron wall sconces, the kind of temporary rigging you might see at a construction site. Long mahogany tables ran down the center of the room, covered in equipment she didn't immediately have vocabulary for. She registered laptops, communications gear, hard-sided cases. She registered weapons. She registered approximately 20 men, all of them massive, all of them in dark tailored suits that cost more money than she had earned in the last calendar year, all of them having snapped to full alert the moment the doors came open, half of them now pointing firearms in her direction. The floor near the far wall had a dark, wet stain that someone had been in the process of cleaning with a mop when she interrupted them. The mop was still standing there, unattended, leaning against an overturned bucket. One of the men had a cloth in his hand that was the deep, unambiguous red of fresh blood. Harper's heart stopped. Then it started again at approximately 3 times its normal speed. Her whole body went cold in a way that had nothing to do with the rain soaking her jacket. Every self-preservation instinct she possessed, and she had quite a few, all fired simultaneously. And then something else fired too. Some other part of her that was perhaps less intelligently calibrated for survival. The part that had gotten her through eviction from her own apartment 6 months ago by arguing with the property manager for 45 minutes until he agreed to waive the late fee. That part looked at the 20 armed men, looked at the blood on the floor, looked at the military hardware arranged on tables that legally belonged to her, and decided that the correct strategic response was offense. She walked in. Her boots were loud on the stone floor. She pulled her hood down as she walked, shook the rain out of her hair, and kept her eyes straight ahead. She passed the nearest cluster of men, who tracked her with weapons and expressions of uniform disbelief. She kept walking until she reached the head of the main table, set the manila folder down on the mahogany surface, and spread her hands flat on either side of it. Then she looked up. The man at the head of the table had not moved. He had not pointed a weapon at her. He had not changed his expression. He sat in a high-backed chair that was as close to a throne as a chair could be, without the addition of a crown. One arm resting on the armrest, watching her approach with the absolute stillness of something very large and very dangerous that is deciding whether a situation warrants its direct involvement. He was the biggest person she had ever seen in a room that was not a professional sporting event. 6.5 feet, at minimum. The kind of muscular that was not decorative, but structural. The kind built for actual use. Dark hair, close cropped on the sides. A jaw that looked like it had been carved rather than grown. Piercing dark eyes that were currently fixed on her with the focused attention of a predator watching something small move across an open field. He had a tattoo climbing the side of his neck, intricate dark lines that disappeared into his collar. His suit was perfect. His hands, resting still on the armrest and the table edge, were enormous. Harper took all of this in over approximately 2 seconds and then decided, as a matter of survival strategy, to look him directly in the eyes and not stop. She tapped the property deed. "I'm going to need everyone to put those away," she said, and her voice only cracked slightly on the last word, which she considered a personal victory. "I'm not here to cause problems. I'm here because this building belongs to me." Complete silence. The rain was loud against the boarded windows. One of the men near the side wall made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was headed in that direction. Another one, standing directly to her left, had gone, so still she wasn't sure he was breathing. The man at the head of the table said nothing. His eyes hadn't moved from her face. Harper pulled the deed out of the folder, turned it to face him, and slid it forward on the table. "Harper Voss! I inherited this property 3 weeks ago. I have the deed, the estate transfer paperwork, and a very unhelpful letter from a probate lawyer confirming that it is, in fact, legally mine." She straightened up. "Now, I don't know what your arrangement was with my great-aunt, and honestly, I don't want to know, but I need you and your crew here," she gestured broadly at the room, "to either start paying rent or start earning your keep, because this roof has 4 separate leaks and the east wall is 1 rainstorm away from being a window." She crossed her arms. "Also, whoever was using the 3rd floor as a gym needs to stop. The floorboards cannot handle it." The man at the head of the table had gone very, very still. Something had changed in him in the last 10 seconds. She couldn't name it exactly, but his expression, which had been the controlled flatness of someone who had not personally experienced surprise in quite some time, had shifted. Not softened. Shifted. His nostrils had flared once, barely perceptible, and then something moved behind those dark eyes that she did not have the context to interpret. His right hand, the one resting on the table, had closed slowly into a fist, then released. The man to his immediate left, broad-shouldered with a scar bisecting one eyebrow, had been in the process of reaching inside his jacket. He stopped. His eyes flicked to his boss with an expression that Harper could only describe as confused alarm. The look of a man who has just watched something completely unprecedented occur. The Alpha King of the Crimson Syndicate, the man who had ordered 17 enemy operations dismantled in the last calendar year, who had not flinched when someone put a blade against his throat in a parking garage 4 months ago, who his lieutenants had privately compared to a force of nature in the sense that you did not negotiate with it, you simply got out of the way, stood up. He stood slowly, to his full height, which, Harper observed, was significantly more height than she had appreciated while he was seated. Then he moved his right hand behind his back, tucked something away, straightened his jacket, and the most feared man in Shadowmoon City lowered his eyes. "My apologies," Silas said. His voice was low, a dark rumble that seemed to come from somewhere in his chest. "We should have contacted you before settling in. That was discourteous." He paused. His jaw worked slightly. "The roof on the east wing. We'll have someone up there tomorrow morning." The scarred lieutenant made a sound like a man accidentally inhaling a drink. Silas did not look at him. Harper stared up at the enormous, terrifying man now regarding the flagstone floor with the expression of someone receiving a well-deserved talking to, and felt the specific vertigo of a situation she did not yet have a category for. "Right," she said finally. "Good. And the floorboards?" "I'll handle it personally," Silas said, still not looking up. "I apologize for the mess." The briefest pause. "Landlady." Somewhere behind her, in the stunned silence of 20 elite assassins who had collectively witnessed the impossible, someone's weapon hit the floor with a clatter. Nobody moved to pick it up. By the second morning, Harper had established a chore chart. It was taped to the inside of the kitchen door, written in her neat illustrator's hand on a piece of graph paper she'd found in the bottom of her bag. The boxes ruled out with a ballpoint pen, and filled in with tasks organized by floor and urgency. She'd color-coded it with 3 different pens: red for structural and maintenance, blue for cleaning, green for outdoor work. There were 22 names on it, all collected the previous evening when she'd gone around the table with her notebook and asked each man to tell her his name so she could spell it correctly. Most of them had looked at their boss before answering. Silas had given her a look she was beginning to recognize, a kind of intense, focused attention that seemed disproportionate to whatever minor thing had prompted it, like the way a very large dog tracks movement in a room. Then he'd nodded, once, and after that they'd all answered. Some of the names she was fairly certain were not real. Wraith. Dagger. The one everyone called Seven, who had not offered any alternative. She'd written them all down without comment. On the chore chart, they looked oddly cheerful. Wraith, east bathroom, upper floor. Dagger, window frames, second hall. Seven, gutters, north side, weather permitting. She stood back and looked at it with the satisfaction of someone who has imposed order on a small piece of chaos, then went to put the kettle on. Through the kitchen window, she could see the backyard. Silas was out there. He'd been out there since just after 7, working through the woodpile that had been stacked against the garden wall since what looked like the previous decade, the logs gray and split and badly arranged. He'd apparently decided that splitting fresh timber was the more productive approach, because he'd located an axe somewhere on the property and was currently working through a section of felled oak with the systematic efficiency of someone who found this restful. He was not wearing a shirt. Harper poured hot water over her tea bag and observed this fact with the detached interest of a person encountering a landscape that is technically outside their area of expertise, but is objectively remarkable. He had the kind of physique that suggested he had not built it in a gym so much as simply lived a physical life, and this was what had happened as a result. Wide across the shoulders, in a way that made the doorways of the manor look like they had been designed for a smaller species. The tattoos she'd glimpsed at his collar turned out to extend considerably further, dark geometric lines and older, more intricate patterns covering most of his back and both arms, shifting over muscle as he swung the axe. A pale scar ran from his left shoulder to the middle of his ribs. Another crossed his right forearm. She added milk to her tea and went to find out who had started on the east wing roof. The answer, it turned out, was 3 men she knew from the chore chart as Rook, Cass, and the one with the scar over his eyebrow who'd told her his name was Marco, though she'd noticed none of the others used it. They were up on the roof in the rain gear she'd found hanging in the utility room, with actual roofing materials that had appeared in the front drive early that morning in the back of an unmarked van. She didn't ask about the van. She noted that the materials were correct for the job and that the work being done was methodical and competent, more than competent, actually, and she went back inside. In the upstairs east bathroom, she found two of the larger men she hadn't yet managed to match to names, crouched in front of the bathtub in pink rubber gloves, scrubbing tile grout with the expressions of individuals enduring something they would not be discussing with anyone after the fact. One of them looked up when she appeared in the doorway. His face was a catalog of scars and weathering. He appeared to be approximately the size of a wardrobe. The pink gloves were the kind with the little flower pattern at the wrist. They did not suit him. "Looking good," Harper said, studying the grout. It was, in fact, looking significantly better than it had. "Make sure you get the area around the base of the taps. That's where it goes black." The man looked at her with an expression she was choosing to interpret as attentiveness. "I'll check back in an hour," she said, and left them to it. She found 7 in the first-floor hallway, pulling loose boards off a window frame with a pry bar, examining them with what appeared to be genuine professional assessment before setting them aside. She told him the replacement timber she'd located in the basement was probably serviceable for most of the frames, and he looked at her for a moment and then said, in a voice like gravel, that he'd have a look. She thanked him. He appeared entirely unprepared for being thanked and had no follow-up response, so she moved on. By noon, the manor smelled of sawdust and cleaning product and wood smoke from a fire someone had lit in the Great Hall's main fireplace, which she had also not asked about because it was cold and she had no immediate objections to warmth. By mid-afternoon, she had completed her preliminary structural sketches for the grant application she was working on, the one that might get the manor on the historical registry and therefore eligible for restoration funding, eaten a late breakfast standing over the kitchen sink, and driven herself to the discount mart 2 kilometers down the main road. She bought potatoes, a lot of them, and carrots, onions, 2 cans of condensed broth, a block of the cheaper cheddar, and a large bag of frozen peas that was on sale. She also bought butter, salt, black pepper, and a box of dried herbs that claimed to be mixed Italian blend, and probably were, more or less. The total came to less than 30 credits, which left her feeling accomplished in the way that only true budgetary efficiency could produce. Back in the manor kitchen, which was enormous and had 6 burner rings and oven capacity for what she estimated was a small catering operation, she got to work. The casserole was a recipe from her grandmother's handwritten card, which she had memorized because she had made it approximately 80 times since leaving home at 18. It was not a sophisticated dish. It was a feeding dish, designed for cold weather and limited funds and a large number of people who needed to stop being hungry. She peeled and cubed potatoes until her wrists ached, sweated down the onions in more butter than was strictly defensible, layered everything into the 2 largest baking pans she could find, covered them with foil, and put them in the oven at a temperature her grandmother had described as hot enough. The oven, it turned out, ran significantly hotter than its dial suggested. She pulled the casseroles out 50 minutes later with oven mitts on both hands and assessed the situation with clear eyes. The tops were, in places, more deeply browned than she'd intended. The peas had gone a grayish green. The cheese had crisped to a dark amber at the edges of the pan. The carrots had softened to the point of being more of a suggestion than a structural element. It smelled fine. It smelled like hot food on a cold day, which, she reasoned, was the point. She set them on the long kitchen table and went to the door. "Dinner," she called down the hall, feeling somewhat ridiculous. She heard boots on stone. A lot of boots. They filed in, these enormous, dangerous men in their dark suits and their work-roughened hands. And they stood around the kitchen in a loose formation that was technically a line, but had the spatial organization of people who do not normally queue for anything. Harper ladled casserole into bowls she'd found in the back of a cupboard and handed them down the line with the focused efficiency of someone running a soup kitchen. Silas came in last. He'd put on a shirt, eventually. He sat at the end of the kitchen table and accepted his bowl without comment, his dark eyes moving from the food to her face with that disproportionate attentiveness she was getting used to. She sat across from him because it was the open seat and watched the room. There was a beat of silence in which approximately 20 elite underworld operatives looked at their bowls. The man she'd mentally labeled Enforcer 1, vast across the shoulders, tattoos on both hands, lifted his spoon. He took a small amount. He put it in his mouth. His expression underwent a brief, involuntary journey across several regions of response. He swallowed. Silas looked at him. The look was not long. It was not theatrical. It was the kind of look that communicated something very specific without any words being necessary. The kind of look that men in certain professions understood to mean that hesitation was the more dangerous option. Enforcer 1 took a full spoonful, then another. Around the table, like a wave, the others followed. Spoons lifted. Food was consumed. Several of the men were blinking more than was typically required for the act of eating. One of the younger ones, the one she'd heard the others call Finn and who could not have been more than 25, had gone slightly red around the eyes in a way that might have been the heat of the food, or might have been something else. "It's good," said Marco, from somewhere in the middle of the table. His voice had the careful quality of a man choosing his words with precision. "Really good. Thank you." A beat. Then, around the table, the others followed his lead with the same slightly over-emphatic sincerity of people who have been given a non-verbal instruction and are executing it to the best of their ability. "Very good. Best thing I've eaten this week." "The potatoes are excellent." This from 7, which was arguably his longest recorded sentence. Finn, still slightly red around the eyes, nodded with great conviction. "The cheese," he said, gesturing at his bowl with his spoon. "The cheese on top especially." Harper looked around the table. Then she looked down at her own bowl. The potatoes were somewhat grainy. The peas had the texture of things that had been frozen, thawed, and then heated past the point of optimism. The cheese on top was, in the places where it hadn't gone dark amber, the color of old wax. She took a bite. It was honestly fine. It was not her best execution of the recipe. She looked up to find Silas watching her with the focused attention she was, she realized, going to need to consciously stop noticing as much as she was noticing it. He had eaten half his bowl already. He picked up his spoon and ate another measured bite with the unhurried manner of a man at a table where he has decided the food is acceptable. No performance in it, no visible effort, just quiet, deliberate eating. "The roof team did good work today," Harper said, because the silence had become the kind she felt obligated to fill. "The east section should hold through the rest of the season if the flashing stays put." Silas nodded. "I'll have them check the seal on the north side as well. There's a weakness in the stone above the third window." She looked at him. "You checked the north side?" "This morning." "Before or after the wood?" "Before." Harper processed this. She had been up at 6:45, and he had apparently already walked the perimeter of a large gothic manor in the rain, assessed structural vulnerabilities, and then spent 3 hours splitting timber in the backyard. She decided not to examine what that information did to her working theory about him being an unemployed man with a lot of heavily tattooed friends and a flexible schedule. "There's also a drainage issue on the west path," he added. "The ground's compacted. Water's pooling against the foundation on that side. If it freezes in winter, it'll crack the stone." "Can it be fixed without heavy equipment?" "Regrading and a French drain. 2 days of labor, maybe 3. She looked at him steadily. "You know a lot about property maintenance for someone who was squatting in a condemned manor." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. It wasn't quite a smile. It was the place where a smile would be if the surrounding architecture weren't so committed to a different structural approach. "I've renovated properties before," he said. "Here and there." "Here and there," Harper repeated. She ate another bite of the suboptimal casserole and made a note in the small notebook she'd taken to keeping in her cardigan pocket. "West path drainage. French drain. 2 to 3 days." She underlined it. Down the table, Enforcer 1 had finished his bowl and was looking at the casserole pan on the counter with an expression she couldn't entirely read. She picked up the ladle. "Do you want more?" He looked at her. He looked at Silas. Silas was looking at his own bowl. "Yes," said Enforcer 1, with the resolve of a man walking into something. "Please." Harper got up and ladled him a second serving. He accepted it with both hands and the formal gravity of someone receiving something significant. She refilled 2 more bowls on her way back to her seat. Finn held his out without being asked, and then looked briefly startled at himself. The kitchen was warm from the oven, and the fire someone had kept going in the great hall was pushing heat down the corridor, and the rain had settled into the steadier evening rhythm that Shadowmoon City did from October through March. A low, continuous sound against the stone and the boarded windows. Harper finished her dinner and pushed her bowl back and opened her notebook to the structural sketches she'd been working on. "What are those?" Silas asked. "Drawings for a grant application. Historical registry." She turned the notebook so he could see the elevation sketch of the front facade, dimensions noted along the margins. "If the building qualifies, there's restoration funding available. Not a lot, but enough to fix the foundation work properly and maybe address the East Tower before it becomes a liability." He looked at the drawing with the same focused attention he appeared to give everything. His eyes tracked the lines. He was quiet for a moment. "The lintel above the main entrance is original dressed stone. Possibly pre-city construction, based on the cut technique. That detail would support the registry application." Harper stared at him. "The ironwork on the interior stair is the same period," he continued, in the tone of someone relaying practical information. "And the hearth in the Great Hall has a maker's mark on the back plate. It's partially obscured by soot, but it's there." She kept staring. "You'd want photographs of all 3 for the supporting documentation," he said, and picked up his glass. Harper wrote lintel, stair ironwork, hearth maker's mark in her notebook. Then she looked up. "How do you know about pre-city construction cut techniques?" Silas considered her question with the same unhurried quality he brought to everything. The firelight from the hall moved at the edge of the kitchen doorway. Around the table, the others had gone collectively still, in the particular way she'd noticed they did when she and Silas were talking directly, a kind of shared watchfulness that she'd initially found odd and was slowly filing under the general category of things about this household she hadn't fully explained yet. "I read," he said finally. Harper looked at him for another 3 seconds. Then she wrote "reads a lot" under his name in the margin of her notebook, added an asterisk, and closed it. "Right," she said. "Tomorrow I want to start on the west corridor. The plaster's coming off the walls in sheets, and there's at least one section of floor that sounds hollow when you walk on it." She looked around the table, at the assembled faces. "Whoever has relevant experience with subfloor work, let me know in the morning. I'll make oatmeal." There was a pause in which she was fairly certain she heard someone's jaw tighten at the prospect of more of her cooking. "I have experience with subfloor work," said Marco, with the noble resignation of a man volunteering for something. "Me too," said Finn, immediately, and then looked like he'd surprised himself again. "Good." Harper gathered her notebook and her empty bowl and stood up. 7. If the weather clears, I want the gutters done before the next rain front comes through, which according to the forecast is Thursday. She carried her bowl to the sink, rinsed it, and set it on the drying rack. "Thank you all for dinner." There was a murmured chorus of responses around the table, some more coherent than others. She was halfway down the corridor toward the stairs when she heard it, low enough that it wasn't meant for her, Marco's voice somewhere behind her saying, with the flat emphasis of someone summarizing a situation, "She thanked us for eating her cooking that she made for us." A pause. Then Silas's voice, quieter, carrying the same not-quite-smile quality she'd seen at dinner. "Go to bed, Marco." Harper climbed the stairs to her room, which she'd claimed on the 2nd floor, the one with the least drafts and a lock on the door that still worked. She sat on the edge of the bed in the dark for a moment, listening to the rain, thinking about pre-city construction techniques and French drains, and the way a man who walked like he owned every room he entered had looked at the floor when she'd asked him about the floorboards. Then she opened her notebook and added to the list of things requiring investigation. She underlined it twice. She was dreaming about the grant application when the first shot went through the upper window. The sound hit the manor like a physical blow, a sharp crack that she processed as sound before she processed it as meaning. The way the brain delays bad news when it's arriving faster than expected. She came upright in bed in the dark, heart already ahead of her thoughts, and then the second shot came, and the third, and then something else. A sound she didn't have a reference for. Somewhere between a roar and something older and more fundamental than a roar. The kind of sound that reaches past the thinking parts of the brain and goes directly to the part that knows, without analysis, what a predator sounds like. She was out of bed before she'd decided to move. Her feet hit the cold floor. She grabbed her cardigan off the bedpost, pushed her arms through it over her pajamas. The noise downstairs had escalated into something she was parsing in real time. Boots on stone, shouting in a language she didn't recognize. More shots. The sound of something very heavy hitting a wall. She looked around the room in the thin light coming through the curtains, the ambient gray of Shadowmoon City's night sky reflecting off the clouds, and her eyes landed on the broom she'd brought up 2 days ago to sweep the accumulated grit off her floor and not yet returned to the utility room. She grabbed it. She told herself, on the way down the stairs, that these were local street elements. The manor was on the edge of the city's outer district, isolated, half derelict, a known target for opportunists. Her tenants, these large, somewhat mysterious, deeply impractical men who had managed to fix a roof and clean an entire floor of bathrooms without, as far as she could tell, any prior domestic experience, were probably terrified. They were probably cornered. They'd been so careful not to cause any trouble, eating her burnt casserole without complaint, sweeping the corridors in the mornings, and here was some local criminal element deciding the manor was an easy mark. She was furious. She hit the bottom of the staircase at a run, turned the corner into the main hall, and stopped. The hall was lit in fragments. 3 of the work lights had been knocked over. The mahogany tables were overturned, shoved back against the walls, and there were men she didn't recognize moving through the space in tactical formation. Dark clothes, masks, carrying weapons that were not the kind of thing local street elements carried. She counted 6 of them. Maybe more in the shadows. Her own tenants were in various states of engagement at the far end of the hall and near the side entrance. And she registered in the back of her mind that they were moving with a speed and coordination and complete absence of fear that was not, in retrospect, consistent with her working theory about their backgrounds. Marco had 2 men on the ground already. Finn was doing something to a third that she declined to look at directly. Silas was at the center of the hall. He was facing down 4 of the masked men alone, and he was not moving, which she understood only later was because he was actively choosing not to, holding the line, because behind him the mouth of the staircase was open and her room was at the top of it. One of the masked men raised his weapon and pointed it at the largest center mass available. Harper stepped forward out of the stairwell entrance and swung the broom handle at the nearest attacker's arm with everything she had. The crack of wood on forearm was satisfying in the way that only pure reflexive action can be, before consequence catches up to instinct. The man turned toward her. She stepped in front of Silas, because he was there and she was already moving, and raised the broom between them and the 4 armed men. "I have called the police," she announced, at a volume designed to carry across a large space, "and you have about 4 minutes to get out of this building before this becomes a much worse situation for all of you." Total silence for approximately 2 seconds. Then one of the masked men said something to another in the unfamiliar language. Harper's grip on the broom tightened. Her heart was doing something she was going to have to think about later. A kind of sustained, high-note panic that she was managing by not acknowledging it directly. She was aware that she was standing in her pajamas and a cardigan with a household cleaning implement between a woman she could see had a very serious weapon and whatever was directly behind her, which was a very large and very still man who had stopped making any sound at all. She didn't look back. She kept her eyes on the masked men and said, more quietly, "I mean it. Leave." One of them raised the weapon, and then the sound started behind her. It was not a sound she'd heard before. She'd heard dogs. She'd heard large dogs. She'd once been in a safari park and heard a lion make a sound that had physically vibrated her sternum. This was none of those things, or it was all of them compressed into something that shouldn't come out of a person. A deep subsonic cracking sound like a very old tree in a very high wind, and under it something wet and structural and wrong. She felt the air pressure in the room change. Warm, like a door to somewhere very hot had been briefly opened. One of the masked men took a step backward. She finally turned around. Silas was still there. He was also no longer entirely Silas, in any way she had a word for. The process was most of the way complete, and the parts that weren't yet were the parts she would later spend a significant amount of time not thinking about. The geometry of things rearranging under skin, the crack of joints finding new configurations, the suit which had not survived the transition and was now simply not relevant anymore. What was standing in the hall, in the space where a 6'5" man had been, was something that made the scale of that description seem modest and a little naive. The wolf was black. Not dark brown, not charcoal. Black. The absolute light-eating black of deep water at night. It stood at a height that put its shoulders above her eyeline, which put its head somewhere she was not going to calculate right now. Its eyes were open, and they were red. Not the red of ordinary eye shine, not a reflection. Red from inside, active and fully aware, and fixed on the masked men with an attention that was nothing like the focused consideration she'd grown accustomed to over dinner. This was not consideration. This was a targeting system. It made a sound that she felt in her back teeth. The masked men broke. Two of them ran for the side entrance. The wolf moved, and she understood then what blinding speed actually meant, because there was no interval between its being here and its being there. No visible transit. Just the fact of its position changing between one moment and the next the way a thought changes. The two men did not reach the side entrance. The other two turned toward the main doors. Marco and Finn were already there. That was the end of that. Harper stood in the middle of the hall in her pajamas holding a broom and did not move. The wolf turned. It looked at her. The red eyes tracked from her feet to her face, and the sound it was making, the low continuous sound she was feeling more than hearing, shifted in pitch. Not quieter. Different. The difference between a sound that means danger and a sound that means something more complicated than danger. Something that has danger in it, but is not primarily danger. She looked back at it. Okay, she said, because saying nothing felt worse, and she had, at this point, committed to the strategy of talking at things until the situation clarified. Her voice was steady. She noted this with a remote kind of surprise. Okay, I don't know what's happening right now. The wolf lowered itself, not onto the ground, but down. A deliberate reduction in its own height, the massive head dropping below the level of her eyes, the enormous body angling toward the floor, making itself smaller, or trying to. She had no frame of reference for the behavior, but something in her read it the same way she'd read the lowered eyes at the mahogany table 4 days ago, the tucked weapon, the apologetic tone. The sound it was making shifted again. Lower. More careful. Marco's voice came from the side of the hall, strained with something she'd never heard in it before. The specific strain of someone trying very hard to speak normally under abnormal circumstances. He won't hurt you. A pause. He would rather be destroyed than hurt you. Harper looked at the massive black wolf, making itself as small as it could manage in her inherited manner. She looked at the red eyes, which had not left her face. She looked at the hall, which was going to need significant cleaning in the morning, and the broom, which she was still holding. She thought about the West Path drainage assessment, the hearthmaker's mark, the pre-city construction techniques, the way he'd eaten 2 full servings of her worst casserole with complete composure, and told her the lintel above the main entrance was possibly pre-city construction, in the tone of someone sharing something useful. She breathed in. She breathed out. "You could have told me," she said. The wolf made a sound that, if she were mapping it onto any human equivalent at all, and she recognized that this was an enormous concession to make, sounded very much like someone who knows they should have told you and does not have a good answer for why they didn't. She turned around and walked back toward the stairs. At the bottom step, she stopped. "There is still a drainage issue on the West Path," she said to the hall. "I expect it to be addressed by Friday." She went upstairs. Behind her, in the ruined hall of the manor, 20 elite assassins and 1 nightmarish supernatural predator sat in absolute silence for a long moment. Then Marco said, very quietly, "She took the broom with her." Nobody had anything to add to that. She was sitting on the edge of her bed, still holding the broom, when she heard the knock. It was a careful knock, considered. The knock of someone who is aware that they are not in a strong negotiating position and is trying to communicate that awareness through the medium of how their knuckles meet a door. "Come in," she said. The door opened. Silas stood in the doorway in a shirt that one of the others had apparently found for him. Dark, too small across the shoulders, the buttons doing their best. His feet were bare. There was a cut above his left eye that had already stopped bleeding, which told her something she was adding to the general file she was now building on how his biology operated. His face was doing the thing where it was very still and very controlled, and underneath that was something that was neither. He was also, she noted, covered in blood that was not his own. Not extensively, but present. He looked at her. She looked at him. "I owe you an explanation," he said. "That seems accurate," she agreed. He came into the room, and then, to her complete astonishment, he went to his knees. Not ceremonially, not with the composed intention of a man making a planned gesture. It was sudden, the way things happen when the decision has been made below the level of deliberation, his massive frame dropping to the floor in front of her with a sound that was almost desperate, and his arms went around her waist, and the alpha king of the most feared syndicate in 6 territories pressed his forehead against her stomach and held on with the focused, single-minded intensity of something very large that has decided this is the place it is not leaving. Harper sat very still. "Don't make me go," he said, into the fabric of her pajamas. His voice was not the voice from the dinner table, not the voice that had discussed French drains and pre-city construction. It was stripped of all of that. It was just the request. "I'll pay for everything, every repair, every permit, every grant application fee. I have black cards. I have 12 of them. Take all of them. I don't care about the money. I don't care about any of it. Just don't make me leave. Silas. The manor is yours, legally. I'll have the paperwork filed tomorrow. All of it. The title, clear. No liens, no conditions. Silas. I have a lawyer. Several lawyers. It will be done before noon. Silas. She put her hand on the top of his head, the same way she would have stopped anyone from talking. He went silent. She could feel the tension in him through her palm, the held quality of something waiting for a verdict with no way to influence it. How much of what you told me was true? A pause. The drainage assessment. All of that was true. The lintel above the entrance is genuinely pre-city construction. The hearthmark is real. And the part where you were a billionaire alpha running an organized crime empire? Also true. I didn't tell you the second part. I noticed. He looked up at her. The red was gone from his eyes. They were just dark now, and very direct. and carrying a weight of feeling that she was going to need more time than she currently had to properly inventory. "I knew what you were to me the moment you opened that door," he said. "I didn't know how to tell you without losing you before you'd had any chance to see anything other than what I am." "And what are you?" "Exactly what it looked like downstairs." His jaw was set. He didn't flinch from it. "I wanted you to see the other things first." Harper looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the chore chart on the kitchen door, the pink rubber gloves, the way he'd eaten her terrible casserole with the unhurried composure of a man at a Michelin table, and shot Marco a look that had moved through the room like weather, and then calmly asked for the second bowl of carrots. The woodpile, split in the rain before 7 in the morning. The way he'd looked at her structural sketches and told her about the maker's mark in the soot. The way he'd gotten to his knees in the hall in front of his entire assembled syndicate, in the middle of the wreckage of an assassination attempt, and held on. She was furious. She wanted to be clear about that, both to herself and to him. The anger was real, and it was valid, and she was going to come back to it. She had been lied to, by omission if not by word, and she had spent 4 days organizing a household that was in fact a cartel safe house and feeding 22 elite killers potato casserole that she now understood they had eaten under direct threat of death. She was furious. She was also, and this was the part she was less interested in examining in the current moment, acutely aware of his arms around her waist, and the warmth of him, and the way he was looking at her from the floor like the outcome of the next 30 seconds was the only thing in the world that mattered to him, which was, she recognized, an absolutely unreasonable amount of power to give a person you'd known for 4 days, and also, she did not currently care. "Get up," she said. He stood. He was very close and very tall, and the shirt that was too small was not helping her maintain the analytical distance she was attempting to maintain. "You're going to tell me everything," she said. "No omissions. Not tonight, because it's 2 in the morning and there's been a lot of things happening, but tomorrow, over breakfast, all of it." "Yes. And the manor paperwork. Before noon. And your lawyers are going to help me with the historical registry application." Something shifted in his face, the not-quite smile finding more room than it usually allowed itself. "I have 2 partners who specialize in heritage property law." "Of course you do." She looked up at him, and the anger was still there. But underneath it was something that had been underneath it since the second evening when she'd watched him through the kitchen window and thought, with the detached clarity of someone who doesn't want to be having the thought, that the landscape was objectively remarkable. "You should have told me." "I know. You should have told me on the first day." "I know that too." She held his gaze for another 3 seconds, which was, it turned out, approximately how long her resolution lasted. And then he closed the distance and she let him. And his hands came up to her face with a care that was entirely inconsistent with everything she'd seen him be in the last 20 minutes. The focused tenderness of someone handling something that matters more than anything else he's ever handled. The kiss was not gentle. It was the opposite of the careful knock on her door. It was every held thing released at once. And it tasted like relief, like something that had been waiting past the point of patience. She grabbed the front of the borrowed shirt, and he made a sound against her mouth that she felt in her sternum, and then he lifted her, simply picked her up, as though the logistics were irrelevant, which for him, they apparently were, and carried her down the hall to the master bedroom, which was 3 times the size of the one she'd claimed, and had a fireplace that someone had lit earlier in the week, and a bed with an actual frame, and he pushed the door shut behind them. What passed between them in that room belonged only to that room. What she could say, afterward, lying in the dark with his heartbeat under her ear, and his arm a warm, immovable weight across her, was that he had been as honest there as he'd failed to be anywhere else, and that whatever else he was, whatever the red eyes and the black wolf and the 12 lawyers and the 12 black cards amounted to, in that room, he had been entirely and without reservation hers. She lay in the quiet and listened to his breathing even out towards sleep and thought about what it meant to own something. She had inherited a crumbling manor from a great-aunt she'd barely known, a pile of stone and rot and possibility at the edge of a city. And she had arrived with her notebooks and her grant application and her grandmother's casserole recipe and her willingness to make a list and work through it. She had not arrived expecting anything other than the work. She had certainly not arrived expecting 22 assassins and a man who could become something ancient and terrible, and had chosen, instead, to clean her bathrooms. She'd thought, in the early days of her adult life, that power was a loud thing, that it announced itself. The men she'd known, who needed to be understood as powerful, had always needed you to understand it, had worn it like a sign. What she understood now, in the dark, with the most feared alpha in 6 territories asleep with his face pressed into her hair, was that the loudest thing about real power was what it chose to be quiet for, what it chose to be careful with, what it was willing, without being asked and without condition, to get on its knees for. She fell asleep thinking about the West Path drainage. It would need to be started before the frost. In the morning, before she came downstairs, before the breakfast that would involve full disclosure and several difficult conversations, and at least one significant argument she was already organizing her points for, she looked out her window at the garden. 7 was in the rose beds. He was watering them with the methodical focus he brought to gutters and window frames, moving along the row with a can he'd found somewhere, his face arranged in its usual expression of a man who has accepted the world as it is. Behind him, Marco was deadheading the spent blooms with a pair of garden shears, his tattooed hands working carefully around the thorns. Finn was on his knees pulling weeds from the border with the earnest focus of someone who has been told the border requires weeding and has decided to do it correctly. From the far end of the garden, she heard Silas's voice, low and carrying, giving what sounded like a briefing. Operational tempo, territory update, 3 syndicates and a logistics problem, and a shipment moving through the northern corridor. She watched Marco pause his deadheading to take notes in a small black book. She watched 7 continue watering the roses without breaking rhythm. She opened her notebook to a fresh page and wrote, at the top, Heritage Registry Application, Supporting Documentation. Below it, lintel, stair ironwork, hearthmaker's mark. Then she went downstairs to make oatmeal. If you enjoyed this hilarious mistaken identity shifter romance audiobook, please hit the like button and subscribe for more epic stories.